Fletcher Tabuto.
Thank you, sir. Let's be clear, Mr Bishop, who's shaking his head and grinning at me, that this is a poor response from this government, who are singing from a song sheet, and then when you look at the bill, there's nothing in it, there's no substance, and you're told by your own experts that it will achieve absolutely nothing, even in combination with the other piece of legislation that was supposed to address the issue. Let's be clear, this is in response to what we all know to be a very serious housing price bubble in the Auckland property market. It's still ongoing. It's been growing exponentially almost month after month, and even some of the calculations are telling us day after day, Mr Speaker. It's moving at a staggering speed, and the problem for New Zealand First is that we already have this problem of generation rent, and this is just increasing it day by day. It's a huge problem, and this legislation is doing nothing about it. Real New Zealanders are worried, and the National Party knows that their support base are worried, and here we now have a piece of legislation which unfortunately does not address the issue but will be spun out in the media, and the people of New Zealand will be placated and told something is being done. But it is not. It is absolutely not. And whilst I'm reticent to do this and always reluctant to hold my colleagues on this side of the House to account, I can unfortunately say that over the last few days, the Labour and the Green members have spoken more eloquently against this piece of legislation than I have. They have spoken about it being a waste of the piece of paper it is written on, how hollow it is, how full of loopholes it is, and yet here we are, and New Zealand First is the only party in the House opposing this absolute waste of time presented to us in the House by this national government. I say to my colleagues on this side of the House, I have believed every word that you have said it eloquently, stand behind your convictions and actually show New Zealanders what this piece of legislation is, that it is a waste of time. New Zealand First does support an initiative to increase tax, especially on overseas speculators, as outlined by the Minister in her opening address. But the bill does actually not do this, Mr Speaker. It has been rushed through with limited consultation and limited opportunity for New Zealanders to have their say. The bill does not achieve this. The government has been advised by their own experts that this bill, even combined with the bright line, or dim line as I'm so wont to call it, bill, will achieve absolutely nothing. It will not achieve anything, sir. We have been told that by the government's own experts. Land Information New Zealand also told this government that they're not ready. They are not ready to process the data. They do not have the software. They do not have the ICT technology to process this information. And as so eloquently pointed out by members on this side of the House, it literally means they'll be writing out this information by hand. It just seems like a waste of time when we know from the government's own experts, sir, that this piece of legislation will not increase tax take and will not put any kind of stymie on overseas speculation in the market.
That's right.
That's right. The main home exclusion. We were told that New Zealanders would worry needlessly about having to present their IRD number, and yet in other parts of the legislation it was said, well, we'll have to tell New Zealanders what this means, but they're not willing to tell them about it now. New Zealanders will not worry needlessly. It does not add complexity. It would be a straightforward tick of a box, sir, to add this information for all home purchases so that we can actually create a comprehensive land transfer database that produces meaningful information. In terms of the main home exclusion, we were told about the greatest connection. The Minister in her opening address told us that they were going to use case law to help them implement it. And yet, the government's own legal experts advised this Minister and the Select Committee that there is no precedent in New Zealand law for this term. Absolutely no precedent use of in case law in New Zealand, sir. It makes no sense whatsoever, and the confusion has already begun on that side of the house. The main home should not be exempt from this data collection. We want meaningful data. We can turn that into useful information. Let me just highlight a couple of points that I've spoken about earlier in relation to this combined piece of legislation. There are exclusions for a speculator who buys a piece of rural land, the rural lot, a couple of acres, has a few sheep on it, but then decides to rent it out, and then for whatever reason, sir, decides to sell it for circumstance within the 2-year bright line period. Not included. Not included in this. Living in the property, doing it up, and then selling it within the 2-year bright line period. It doesn't matter if you've got the information, sir. You're not included in the tax provisions of that legislation. Speculators won't be identified. And then I put it to the Minister, actually, sir, what are the provisions within this law or even other law, pieces of legislation, for the actual collection of the tax burden required of those overseas speculators who didn't actually manage to fall through the multitude of loopholes? Where is it that we will be able to actually go and collect that tax? It has been suggested to this government that those people pay a bond on the purchase of their homes. I think, although I wouldn't agree to overseas speculators buying homes in New Zealand at all, I think you won't be able to implement that. But it just makes no sense. We want to develop meaningful information. And then I just want to address something Mr. Bennett said earlier in the piece about Labor's shifting on capital gains. Mr. Speaker, the problem with this piece of legislation is that what it's doing is actually adding another level of complexity to current and existing legislation. Without doubt, uncategorically, this government has in place already a capital gains tax. It just chooses not to implement it. It chooses not to ask its ministries, appropriate ministry, to implement it. And they choose to call it by another name. I don't know what, but the law says if you make a gain on the sale of your property, you'll pay a tax on that. If that's not a capital gains tax, sir, I don't know what is. This government simply chooses not to enforce it, and here we are not only creating loopholes, but we're adding more levels of complexity. It seems to be a contradiction in terms, but this government in their absolute, I don't want to say it, has managed to do that, sir. New Zealand First, unlike the rest of the side of this House, cannot support this legislation, even though its intent is something New Zealand First would like to see. It is truly, sir, a waste of this House's time.